Good morning. We're here, episode 48, reading the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice, approximately 10 minutes a day. And today we're reading from chapter 13, Leo Tolstoy, from The Slavery of Our Times, 1900. And we're starting at the top of page 183, so let's just get to reading. Were it not for the defense of landed property and its consequent rise in price, people would not be crowded into such narrow spaces, but would scatter over the free land, of which there is still so much in the world. But as it is, a continual struggle goes on for landed property, a struggle with the weapons government furnishes by means of its laws of landed property. And in this struggle, it is not those who work on the land, but always those who take part in governmental violence that have the advantage. It is the same with reference to things produced by labor. Things really produced by a man's own labor and that he needs are always defended by custom, by public opinion, by feelings of justice and reciprocity, and they do not need to be protected by violence. Tens of thousands of acres of forest lands belonging to one proprietor, while thousands of people close by have no fuel, need protection by violence. So too do factories and works where several generations of workmen have been defrauded are still being defrauded. Yet more do hundreds of thousands of bushels of grain belonging to one owner who has held them back till a famine has come to sell them at triple price. But no man, however depraved, except a rich man or a government official, would take from a countryman living by his own labor the harvest he has raised or the cow he has bred, and from which he gets milk for his children, or the sokas, the scythes, and the spades he has made and uses. If even a man were found who did not take from another articles the latter had made and required, such a man would rouse against himself such indignation from everyone living in similar circumstances that he would hardly find his action profitable for himself. A man so immoral as to do it under such circumstances would be sure to do it as under the strictest system of property defense by violence. It is generally said, quote, only attempt to abolish the rights of property in land and in the produce of labor, and no one will take the trouble to work, lacking the assurance that he will not be deprived of what he has produced. We should say just the opposite. The defense by violence of the rights of property immorally obtained, which is now customary, if it has not quite destroyed, has considerably weakened people's natural consciousness of justice in the matter of using articles, i.e., the natural and innate right of property, without which humanity could not exist, and which has always existed and still exists among all men. And therefore, there is no reason to anticipate that people will not be able to arrange their lives without organized violence. Of course, it may be said that horses and bulls must be guided by the violence of rational beings, men. But why must men be guided, not by some higher beings, but by people such as themselves? Why ought people to be subject to the violence of just those people who are in power at a given time? What proves that these people are wiser than those on whom they inflict violence? The fact that they allow themselves to use violence toward human beings indicates that they are not only not more wise, but are less wise than those who submit to them. The examinations in China for the office of mandarin do not, we know, ensure that the wisest and best people should be placed in power. And just as little is this ensured by inheritance, or the whole machinery of promotions in rank, or the elections in constitutional countries. On the contrary, power is always seized by those who are less conscientious and less moral. It is said, how can people live without government, i.e., without violence? But it should, on the contrary, be asked, how can people who are rational live acknowledging that the vital bond of their social life is violence and not reasonable agreement? One of two things. Either people are rational beings or they are irrational beings. If they are irrational beings, then they are all irrational, and then everything among them is decided by violence. And there is no reason why certain people should and others should not have a right to use violence. And in that case, governmental violence has no justification. But if men are rational beings, then their relations should be based on reason, and not on the violence of those who happen to have seized power. And in that case, again, governmental violence has no justification. How can government be abolished? Slavery results from laws. Laws are made by governments, and therefore, people can only be freed from slavery by the abolition of governments. But how can governments be abolished? All attempts to get rid of governments by violence have hitherto always and everywhere resulted only in this, that in place of the deposed governments, new ones established themselves, often more cruel than those they replaced. Not to mention past attempts to abolish governments by violence, according to the socialist theory, the coming abolition of the rule of the capitalists, i.e., the communalization of the means of production and the new economic order of society, is also to be carried out by a fresh organization of violence, and will have to be maintained by the same means, so that attempts to abolish violence by violence neither have in the past nor evidently can in the future emancipate people from violence nor, consequently, from slavery. It cannot be otherwise. Apart from outbursts of revenge or anger, violence is used only in order to compel some people, against their own will, to do the will of others. But the necessity to do what other people wish against your own will is slavery. And therefore, as long as any violence designed to compel some people to do the will of others exists, there will be slavery. All attempts to abolish slavery by violence are like extinguishing fire with fire, stopping water with water, or filling up one hole by digging another. Therefore, the means of escape from slavery, if such means exist, must be found not in setting up fresh violence, but in abolishing whatever renders governmental violence possible. And the possibility of governmental violence, like every other violence perpetrated by a small number of people upon a larger number, has always depended, and still depends, simply on the fact that the small number are armed while the large number are unarmed, or that the small number are better armed than the larger number. That has been the case in all conquests. It was thus the Greeks, the Romans, the Knights, the Pizarros conquered nations. And it is thus that people are now conquered in Africa and Asia. And in this same way, in times of peace, all governments hold their subjects in subjection. As of old, so now, people rule over other people only because some are armed and others are not. In olden times, the warriors with their chiefs fell upon the defenseless inhabitants, subdued them, and robbed them. And all divided the spoils in proportion to their participation, courage, and cruelty. And each warrior saw clearly that the violence he perpetrated was profitable to him. Now armed men, taken chiefly from the working classes, attack defenseless people, men on strikes, rioters, or the inhabitants of other countries, and subdue them and rob them, i.e., make them yield the fruits of their labor, not for themselves, but for people who do not even take a share in the subjugation. The difference between the conquerors and the governments is only that the conquerors have themselves, with their soldiers, attacked the unarmed inhabitants, and have, in cases of insubordination, carried their threats to torture and to kill into execution, while the governments, in cases of insubordination, do not themselves torture or execute the unarmed inhabitants, but oblige others to do it who have been deceived and specially brutalized for the purpose, and who are chosen from among the very people on whom the government inflicts violence. Thus, violence was formerly inflicted by personal effort, by the courage, cruelty, and agility of the conquerors themselves, but now violence is inflicted by means of fraud. So that if formerly, in order to get rid of armed violence, it was necessary to arm oneself and to oppose armed violence by armed violence. Now, when people are subdued, not by direct violence, but by fraud, in order to abolish violence, it is only necessary to expose the deception which enables a small number of people to exercise violence upon a larger number. The deception by means of which this is done consists in the fact that the small number who rule, on obtaining power from their predecessors who were installed by conquest, say to the majority, "There are a lot of you, but you are stupid and uneducated, and cannot either govern yourselves or organize your public affairs, and therefore we will take those cares on ourselves. We will protect you from foreign foes, and arrange and maintain internal peace among you. We will set up courts of justice, arrange for you and take care of public institutions, schools, roads, and the postal service, and in general, we will take care of your well-being. And in return for all this, you only have to fulfill those slight demands which we make, and, among other things, you must give into our complete control a small part of your incomes, and you must yourselves enter the armies which are needed for your own safety and government." And we will stop right there toward the bottom of page 186, reading Tolstoy from the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice.